Hi, I've been doing hot Cheetos. I've been a hot Cheeto girl today, so this reading might be really interesting. We'll see. I'm doing no recaps. I'm not going to be like last time in Lean Times in Lankhmar. No, you just have to go look at part 1 if you don't know what happened. And you know what? Just, join me. After Fafhrd became his acolyte, things somehow began to change. In the first place, and even if he had contributed nothing else, Fafhrd made a very impressive one-man congregation from the very first day when he turned up so ragged-looking and bloody from the cuts breaking his longsword. His near 7-foot height and still warlike carriage stood out mountainously among the old women, children, and assorted riffraff who made up the odorous, noisy, and vastly fickle crowd of worshippers in the Marshgate end of the Street of the Gods. One could not help thinking that if Isaac of the Jug could attract one such worshipper, the godlet must have unsuspected virtues. Fafhrդ's formidable height, shoulder breadth, and bearing had one other advantage. He could maintain claim to a very respectable area of cobbles for Boisdress and Isaac merely by stretching himself out to sleep on them after the night's services were over. It was at this time that oafs and ruffians stopped elbowing Boisdress and spitting on him. Fafhrd was not pacific in his new personality. After all, Isaac of the Jug was notably a godlet of peace, but Fafhrd had a fine barbaric feeling for the proprieties. If anyone took liberties with Boisdress or disturbed the various rituals of Isaac worship, he would find himself lifted up and sat down somewhere else, with an admonitory thud, if that seemed called for, a sort of informal one-stroke bastinado. Boisdress himself brightened amazingly as a result of this wholly unexpected respite granted him in his divinity on the very brink of oblivion. He began to eat more often than twice a week and to comb his long, skimpy beard. Soon his senility dropped away from him like an old cloak, leaving of itself only a mad, stubborn gleam deep in his yellowly, crust-edged eyes, and he began to preach the gospel of Isaac of the Jug with a fervor and confidence that he had never known before. Meanwhile, Fafhrd, in the second place, fairly soon began to contribute more to the promotion of Isaac of the Jug cult than just his size, presence, and notable talents as a chucker-out. After 2 months of self-imposed absolute silence, which he refused to break even to answer the simplest questions of Boisdress, who at first was considerably puzzled by his gigantic convert, Fafhrd produced a small broken lyre, repaired it, and began regularly to chant the creed and history of Isaac of the Jug at all services. He competed in no way with Boisdress, never chanted any of the litanies or presumed to bless in Isaac's name. In fact, he always kneeled and resumed silence when serving Boisdress as an acolyte. But seated on the cobbles at the foot of the service area while Boisdress meditated between rituals at the head, he would strike melodious chords from his tiny lyre and chant away in a rather high-pitched, pleasing, romantically vibrant voice. Now, as a northerner, but a boy in the cold waste, far poleward of Lankhmar across the inner sea, the forested land of the 8 cities in the Trollstep Mountains, Fafhrd had been trained in the school of the singing skalds, so called, although they chanted rather than sang because they pitched their voices tenor, rather than the school of the roaring skalds who pitched their voices bass. This resumption of a childhood-inculcated style of elocution, which he also used in answering the few questions his humility would permit him to notice, was the real and sole reason for the change in Fafhrd's voice that was made the subject of gossip by those who had known him as the Gray Mouser's deep-voiced swordmate. As delivered over and over by Fafhrd, the history of Isaac of the Jug gradually altered, by small steps which even Boisdress could hardly cavil at had he wished, into something considerably more like the saga of a northern hero, though toned down in some respects. Isaac had not slain dragons and other monsters as a child. That would have been against his creed. He had only sported with them, swimming with the Leviathan, frisking with Behemoth, and flying through the trackless spaces of air on the backs of Wyvern, Griffin, and Hippogriff. Nor had Isaac as a man scattered kings and emperors in battle. He had merely dumbfounded them and their quaking ministers by striding about on fields of poisoned sword points, standing at attention in fiery furnaces, and treading water in tanks of boiling oil, the while delivering majestic sermons on brotherly love and perfect, intricately rhymed stanzas. Wadras Isik had expired quite quickly, though with some kindly parting admonitions after being disjointed on the rack. Fafhrd Isik, now the Isik, had broken 7 racks before he began seriously to weaken. Even when, supposedly dead, he had been loosed and had got his hands on the chief torturer's throat, there had been enough strength remaining in them alone so that he had been able to strangle the wicked man with ease, although the latter was a champion of wrestlers among his people. However, Fafhrd Isik had not done so. Again, it would have been quite against his creed. He had merely broken the torturer's thick brass band of office from around his trembling neck and twisted it into an exquisitely beautiful symbol of the jug before finally permitting his own ghost to escape from him into the eternal realms of spirit, there to continue its wildly wonderful adventurings. Now, since the vast majority of the gods in Lankhmar, rising from the eastern lands, at least from the kindredly decadent southern country around Cornwall, had been in their earthly incarnations rather effete types, unable to bear more than a few minutes of hanging or a few hours of impalement with relatively little resistance to molten lead or showers of barbed darts, also not given overly to composing romantic poetry or to dashing exploits with strange beasts, it is hardly to be wondered at that Isik of the Jug, as interpreted by Fafhrd, swiftly won and held the attention, and soon thereafter also the devotion of a growing section of the usually unstable gods-dazzled mob. In particular, the vision of Isik of the Jug rising up with his rack, striding about with it on his back, breaking it, and then calmly waiting with arms voluntarily stretched above his head until another rack could be readied and attached to him. That vision in particular came to occupy a place of prime importance in the dreams and daydreams of many a porter, beggar, drab scullion, and the brats and aged dependents of such. As a result of this popularity, Isik of the Jug was soon not only moving up the Street of the Gods for a second time, a rare enough feat in itself, but also moving at a greater velocity than any god had been known to attain in the modern era. Almost every service saw Wadras and Fafhrd able to move their simple altar a few more yards toward the citadel end, as their swelling congregations overflowed areas temporarily sacred to gods of less drawing power, and frequently late-coming and tireless worshippers enabled them to keep up services until the sky was reddening with the dawn. 10 or 12 repetitions of the ritual and the yardage gain in one night. Before long, the makeup of their congregations had begun to change. Pursed and then fatter pursed types showed up, mercenaries and merchants, sleek thieves and minor officials, jeweled courtesans and slumming aristocrats, shaven philosophers who scoffed lightly at Wadras' tangled arguments and Isik's irrational creed, but were secretly awed by the apparent sincerity of the ancient man and his giant poetical acolyte. And with these moneyed newcomers came inevitably the iron-tough hirelings of Pulg and other such hawks circling over the foul yards of religion. Naturally enough, this threatened to pose a considerable problem for the Gray Mouser. So long as Isik, Wadras, and Fafhrd stayed within hooting range of the marsh gate, there was nothing to worry about. There, when collection time came, and Fafhrd circled the congregation with cupped hands, the take, if any, was in the form of moldy crusts, common vegetables past their prime, rags, twigs, bits of charcoal, and, very rarely, giving rise to shouts of wonder, bent and dinted greenish coins of brass. Such truck was below the notice of even lesser racketeers than Pulg, and Fafhrd had no trouble whatever in dealing with the puny and dull-witted types who sought to play robber king in the Marshgate's shadow. More than once, the Mouser managed to advise Fafhrd that this was an ideal state of affairs, and that any considerable further progress of Isik up the Street of the Gods could lead only to great unpleasantness. The Mouser was nothing if not cautious, and most prescient to boot. He liked, or firmly believed he liked, his newly achieved security almost better than he liked himself. He knew that, as a recent hireling of Pulg, he was still being watched closely by the great man, and that any appearance of continuing friendship with Fafhrd, for most outsiders thought they had quarreled irrevocably, might someday be counted against him. So on the occasions when he drifted down the Street of the Gods during off hours, that is, by daylight, for religion is largely a nocturnal, torch-lit business in Lankhmar, he would never seem to speak to Fafhrd directly. Nevertheless, he would by seeming accident end up near Fafhrd, and while apparently engaged in some very different private business or pleasure, or perhaps come secretly to gloat over his large enemy's fallen estate, the Mouser... that was the Mouser's second line of defense against the conceivable accusations by Pulg. He He would manage considerable conversations out of the corner of his mouth, which Fafhrd would answer, if at all, in the same way, though in this case presumably from abstraction rather than policy. "Look, Fafhrd," the Mouser said on the third of such occasions, meanwhile pretending to study a skinny-limbed, pot-bellied beggar girl, as if trying to decide whether a diet of lean meat and certain calisthenics would bring out in her a rare Gaminesque beauty. "Look, Fafhrd, right here you have what you want, whatever that is. I think it's a chance to patch up poetry and squeak it at fools, but whatever it is, you must have it here, near the Marsh Gate, for the only thing in the world that is not near the Marsh Gate is money. And you tell me you don't want that, the more fool you. But let me tell you something. If you let Boadres get any nearer the Citadel, yes, even a pebble's toss, you will get money, whether you want it or not. And with that money, you and Boadres will buy something, also willy-nilly, and no matter how tightly you close your purse and shut your ears to the cries of the hawkers, that thing, which you and Boadres will buy, is trouble." Fafhrd answered only with a faint grunt that was the equivalent of a shoulder shrug. He was looking steadily down past his bushy beard with almost cross-eyed concentration at something his long fingers were manipulating powerfully yet delicately, but that the large backs of his hands concealed from the Mouser's view. "How is the old fool, by the way, since he's eating regularly?" the Mouser continued, leaning a hair closer in an effort to see what Fafhrd was handling. "Still stubborn as ever, eh? Still set on taking Isaac to the Citadel? Still as unreasonable about business matters?" "Boadres is a good man," Fafhrd said quietly. "More and more that appears to be the heart of the trouble," the Mouser answered with a certain sardonic exasperation. "But look, Fafhrd, it's not necessary to change Boadres' mind. I'm beginning to doubt whether even Shieldbutt and Ming working together could achieve that cosmic revolution. You can do by yourself all that needs to be done. Just give your poetry a little downbeat. Add a little defeatism to Isaac's creed. Even you must be tired by now of all this ridiculous mating of northern stoicism to southern masochism and wanting a change. One theme's good as another to a true artist. Or, simpler still, merely refrain from moving Isaac's altar up the street on your big night. Or even move it down a little. Boadres gets so excited when you have big crowds, the old fool doesn't know which direction you're going anyhow. You could progress like the well frog. Or, wisest of all, merely prepare yourself to split the take before you hand over the collection to Boadres. I could teach you the necessary legerdemain in the space of one dawn. But you don't really need it. With those huge hands, you can palm anything." "No," said Fafhrd. "Suit yourself," the Mouser said very lightly, though not quite unfeelingly. "Buy trouble if you will, death if you must. Fafhrd, what is that thing you're fiddling with? No, don't hand it to me, idiot. Just let me glimpse it. By the black toga, what is that?" Without looking up or otherwise moving, Fafhrd had cupped his hands sideways, much as if he were displaying in the Mouser's direction a captive butterfly or beetle. And indeed it did seem at first glimpse as if it were a rare large beetle he was cautiously bearing to view, one with a carapace of softly burnished gold. "It is an offering to Isaac," Fafhrd droned. "An offering made last night by a devout lady who was wed in spirit to the god." "Yes, and to half the young aristos of Lankhmar, too, and not all in spirit," the Mouser hissed. "I know one of Lesnia's double spiral bracelets when I see it. Reputedly given to her by the twin dukes of Ilfmar, by the by. What did you have to do to her to get it? Sob? Don't answer, I know. Recite poetry. Fafhrd, things are far worse than I dreamed. If Paul knew you were already getting gold." He let his whisper trail off. "But what have you done with it?" "Fashioned it into a representation of the holy jug," Fafhrd answered, bowing his head a shade farther and opening his hands a bit wider and tipping them a trifle. "So I see," the Mouser hissed. The soft gold had been twisted into a remarkably smooth, strange knot. "And not a bad job at all, Fafhrd. How you keep such a delicate feeling for curves when for 6 months you slept without them against you is quite beyond me. Doubtless such things go by opposites. Don't speak for a moment now, I'm getting an idea." "By the black scapula, a good one. Fafhrd, you must give me that trinket so I may give it to Paul. No, please hear me out and then think this through. Not for the gold in it, not as a bribe or as part of a first split. I'm not asking that of you or Boadres, but simply as a keepsake, a presentation piece. Fafhrd, I've been getting to know Pulg lately, and I find he has a strange sentimental streak in him. He likes to get little gifts, little trophies from his and customers, we sometimes call them. These curios must always be items relating to the god in question. Chalices, censers, bones in silver filigree, jeweled amulets, that sort of thing. He likes to sit looking at his shelves of them and dream. Sometimes I think the man is getting religion without realizing it. If I should bring him this bauble, he would, I know, develop an affection for Isaac. He would tell me to go easy on Wadress. It would probably even be possible to put off the question of tribute money for 3 more squares at least. No, said Fafhrd. So be it, my friend. Come with me, my dear. I'm going to buy you a steak. The second remark was in the mouser's regular speaking voice, and directed, of course, at the beggar girl, who reacted with a look of already practiced and rather languorous affright. Not a fish steak either, puss. Did you know there were other kinds? Toss this coin to your mother, dear, and come. The steak stall is 4 squares up. No, we won't take a litter. You need the exercise. Farewell, death seeker. Despite the wash my hands of you tone of this last whisper, the Gray Mouser did what he could to put off the evil night of reckoning, devising more pressing tasks for Pulg's bullies and alleging that this or that omen was against the immediate settling of the Wadress account, for Pulg, alongside his pink streak of sentimentality, had recently taken to sporting a gray one of superstition.